Hello, and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. In this one, we have several Russian advances in the east, and there's some back and forth in the Kursk region. Starting out in the east, the Russians have expanded their foothold within Konstantinivka, where the real offensive operations are now beginning. The Russian offensive operations in Konstantinivka has been very clear from the start. At the very first, they launched an armored assault from the forest lines to the south towards the southern flank of Konstantinivka and from the east towards the eastern outskirts of the town. This led to a small foothold where the first soldiers managed to enter. Since then, it significantly reduced in size and they continued armored assaults to drop off in additional units. This increased to the point where now the Russians have enough units in the town to start moving from building to building and expanding their foothold. This will allow a larger gap between the Russian and Ukrainian forces and will allow the Russians to, in the cover of the frontline soldiers, send additional forces inside the town, which will continue to grow the forces the Russians have available in the area and then continue offensive operations within it. So we're seeing that this is the Russian tactics in this direction. Many people criticized the Russians for their offensive operations with armored assaults, which led to about a quarter of the armored vehicles getting hit, damaged, and destroyed. However, this is a necessary part of the war. We see that some armored assaults are complete failures in one of two ways. Either they launch an assault but do not commit and they take losses to then retreat, and in that time they have lost some vehicles, they've lost some soldiers, and they didn't gain anything. The other way it can completely fail is if they launch an assault and it just completely destroys. Anything in between that, having large losses but actually gaining a foothold, or having an assault with no losses but nothing gained, are all in the gray zone where it can be counted as a victory or failure. But when you have a few losses and gain a foothold, that is the optimal outcome, because you cannot have no losses. And that is what your job is as an officer or commander in war, and that is to figure out what is the objective of your army. And the way to reach that is, if it is to destroy the enemy army, then it is to take as less losses as possible, as few losses as possible, while inflicting as many losses as possible. If your objective is to take land, then your objective is to concentrate a large force that is large enough to take the land and take as the fewest possible amount of casualties while taking the largest amount of land possible. Therefore, the metrics at which the loss or victory of a force is based upon is dependent on the objective of said force. It is clear that the objective of the Russians here is to gain control of Konstantinivka. For this, they have managed to launch an assault, gain a foothold, and the majority survived. That is in the gray zone where they take losses, but they also gain the foothold. It can be counted as a victory or at a loss, depending on the objective. The objective was to gain a foothold. They reached that objective, therefore they succeeded, and this has evolved into more losses, but more territory gained. And at the same time, they inflict losses on the Ukrainians. Further north in the Pokrovsk section of the front line, the Russians have captured the remaining parts of Ivanivka in the western outskirts, leading to full Russian control of the locality, and the Russians are now moving on to the fortified positions of the Ukrainians northwest and west of Ivanivka, ahead of Rodivka. This is following the capture of Novoselivske, Lysychne, and Ivanivka here in the northern parts, and Vesely and Encircled in the southern parts. Now the Russians have gained control of the majority of the villages east and southeast, leaving only two villages in the northeast under Ukrainian control, ahead of Rodivka. In the south, within Shelane, the Russians have advanced further, gaining control over the western parts of the town as well as the central parts, where fighting continues over the eastern parts. This means that the Russians are now in a position where they're attacking the eastern parts of Shelane from the north, northwest, and west from three separate directions. At the same time, the road to the east has been cut off, meaning the only exit for the Ukrainians is to the south, where the road is completely under Russian control to the east and to the west, leaving only one exit going through to Novoselivske or down southeast towards Kursk or along the river line, and either one of these are within the direct eyesight of Russian soldiers in the roads west and east of Shelane, leading to the rest of the town being operationally encircled, and any Ukrainian soldiers withdrawing would be under direct fire of Russian soldiers. Further north here in the direction of the Drushba, the Russians have managed to capture the northern outskirts of the village, leaving only the central parts and western parts under Ukrainian control. This allows the Russians to have better advantage over the fighting by the canal, where the Ukrainian positions here in the fortified areas along the canal are now under threat from both the south and from the east, as Russians will be able to attack from both of these directions, where the Ukrainians are now split between the two banks of the canal area, and the Russians have flanked the western bank of the canal, which means that the Ukrainians, if they lose their positions in the western bank, the eastern bank would be cut off, and if they lose the positions in the eastern bank, then they would be under fire from the east and from the south, leaving them under heavy pressure. Therefore, the Ukrainian positions here by the canal are in danger, and the Russians may be looking to gain full control over the canal area, strengthening the flank there, removing the Ukrainian forces from the northern flank of Drushba, allowing the Russians to concentrate their forces within the central parts and towards Pivnishne and beyond the second line of the Ukrainians in Toretsk direction. Further north here in the direction of the Kupiansk section of the front line, the Russians have cut off Ukrainian forces along Novoselivske with a flanking maneuver along the Selmahivka river line by the Serbets river line near Selmahivka. The Russians also connected that with an assault from the east or south of Novoselivske, which led to the Ukrainian forces in the area between Novoselivske and the river line to be completely cut off. This has led to the Ukrainians being completely cut off, leading to the Russians gaining full control over the area with this encirclement. The Russians have not just encircled the Ukrainian forces there, but with the operational encirclement in Shelane, as well as the encirclement of Ukrainian forces north of Proris, it seems to be a regular occurrence nowadays, with the Ukrainian defensive positions being understaffed and lacking in both ammunition and weaponry. This leads to the Russians having such a significant advantage that they're able to regularly cut off Ukrainian soldiers and come with these encirclements and large captures of territories here within the Eastern Front. And this is exactly why so many Ukrainian soldiers are complaining about the situation in the north, as if the Ukrainians had this many troops in reserve, why are they not being sent to the front line to deal with the Russian offensive? Moving on to the Kursk direction, we see that the Ukrainians have advanced in two areas and the Russians back in Sutsha. In the south, the Ukrainians have managed to capture this area here by the forest patches west of the Sel River. This leads to the Ukrainians having full control over the western bank of the river line. Further north in Sutsha, the Ukrainians have launched an attack in the northern parts, crossing over the river and gaining control over parts of Sutsha in the eastern parts of it. And the Russians in turn launched a river crossing to the south of those positions, attacking the central parts of Sutsha, recapturing the village of Podol, and moving into the northern parts of Sutsha. Likely what happened here is, based on all of the reports I've read through, we saw numerous reports of the Ukrainians launching additional assaults here in the direction of Korenevo, but failing to advance in this section of the front line. In the northern parts, there were additional Ukrainian assaults, and the Russians in turn launched some counterattacks, but again, no territorial changes due to how heavy the fighting is, and both sides having large enough troops to be able to defend, but not enough troops to actually advance through the defensive forces. This leads to a lot of back and forth fighting. As for the eastern parts here north of Sutsha, the situation is different. In my previous video, I talked about how the Russians have now established a front line, and that the Ukrainians will therefore be unable to make extreme advances like they have been, where they would allow the Ukrainians to capture 100 square kilometers in a day. That part is still correct. However, there is still some gaps in Russia's front line, although it has been established, not fully. And the main part of that is this town here called Martyanovka. According to the reports, the Ukrainians still have a lot of units beyond the front line in the area north of Sucha, but the Ukrainians in several parts in this area here have units that move beyond the front line, past the defensive lines of the Russians, simply avoiding them and moving deeper into Russian territory to establish guerrilla fighting tactics. But the goal there is to ambush Russian convoys sending reinforcements and prevent and slow down the Russians as much as possible from establishing a front line. This has been met with varying levels of success. Some geolocated footage shows Ukrainian soldiers up to 25 kilometers deep into Russian territory. However, the footage that was accompanied with that geolocation simply showed Ukrainian vehicles, multiple tanks, armored fighting vehicles, infantry fighting vehicles, armored personnel carriers, and so on. All of these vehicles with infantry were spotted 25 kilometers deep. This is the strike force, this is the assault squads, the ones who are constantly attacking the Russian lines, while the defensive units are trying to establish their own front line and dig in the areas that the Ukrainians have managed to capture. There are assault units that do not do that, but simply keep advancing, establishing these ambushes, and going deeper into Russian territory. Some of these were spotted further north, further away from the border area. However, they were spotted by Russian troops, which sent Lancet drones and FPV drones to hit them with artillery support, and all of these explosions ended up destroying all of the armored vehicles in this group, and then the Russians sent a counterattack to clear out the infantry associated with this group. So we see that there was heavy fighting deep within Russia at the same time as there's fighting near the front line. And some of this fighting happened near Martinovka, where the Ukrainians had several armored vehicles and units in the area near Martinovka. This led to the Ukrainians ambushing some Russian forces. This turned a Russian convoy going to Sucha into a battle by Martinovka. This battle eventually ended up with a Russian victory, where they planned on proceeding towards Sucha, but at that point the Ukrainians had already captured the northern parts. This is why fighting is now taking place in the northern parts of Sucha on the eastern bank of the river line. At the same time, the Russian troops here in the south likely had received information that an armored convoy was arriving from the direction of Martinovka and down to Sucha to cover the northern flank. Therefore, they were in a position where they could launch offensive operations. So simultaneously with a Ukrainian assault to the north, the Russians launched an assault to the south, where they crossed over the river line to improve their positions in Sucha and try recapturing some of these positions, pushing the Ukrainians back across the border area. Now this ended up being one where the Russians then ended up leaving a part of Sucha almost completely undefended, and this led to the Ukrainian capture of the northern parts. And this is exactly the sort of gaps that the Russians have in the defenses still, until that they have cleared the Ukrainian presence beyond the front line in the areas east of the area, which is completely under Ukrainian control. Therefore, we currently see that there's a lot of back and forth fighting and guerrilla fighting taking place beyond the front line, while at the same time the Russians are establishing the front line. And that is all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon for additional content. Thank you all for watching, and have a great day.